I'm Andrew Rutledge, Bentley Historian and Research Associate, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight to the historic Detroit Observatory, a division. I also want to welcome our online audience on YouTube, and thank you all for joining us on a night that looks like it might be a little story before we're done. Tonight, we offer our third edition of Wolverine Writers, with 3 stories that, as our subtitle indicates, deal with secret histories from U of M's past. Part of the mission of the Detroit Observatory and of the parent institution, the Bentley Library, is to promote appreciation and understanding of university history. And this is an understanding that encompasses not just the many great achievements of students and faculty at U of M, but also the less celebrated, the hidden, and sometimes the shameful moments. It is these latter stories that are our focus here this evening. We at the Bentley are, of course, not alone in our efforts to understand and appreciate the university's past, and I'm thrilled to welcome 3 individuals who, as editors and writers, are also contributing to this understanding through the stories that they write and publish. I think you will find the stories they discuss and the process by which those stories are created penetrating, insightful, and maybe even a little moving.
All right, hi, can everyone hear me? So my story is, we've all heard the adage that truth is stranger than fiction, but how about historical fiction? In the case of former Governor Chase Osborne and his adopted daughter, wife, widow, and Michigan MFA grad Stella Lee Brunt, it definitely is much stranger. The story I'm about to share is not one that I researched and wrote, but my story is about Mary Crum Schultens, who adopted the what's that called? Nom de plume, Ann Arbor, because she is a school teacher, and the book is a little scandalous, and she didn't necessarily want her name associated with it from her career. However, and she grew up here, so she is very much an Ann Arbor person. She is a South Carolina school teacher and 2-time graduate of the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And so my story is about her story, about Chase Osborne and Stella Lee Brunt. So after an issue of Michigan Today went out, I received a classic old school pitch from Mary, a typed letter on paper that came in a stamped envelope to Michigan News. The pitch was clear, specific, and designed to intrigue me, and it did. I'm trying to learn my little cursor here. So here at Michigan, we have a lot of published authors. We have people like Susan Orlean, who wrote The Orchid Thief. We have all these different people. This guy, Steve Hamilton, who's written a crime series about a recurring character named Alex McKnight. We have Jasmine Ward, who's won awards. Brad Meltzer, who just spoke at commencement. Betty Smith, who wrote one of my favorite books, Tree Grows in Brooklyn. But so when you get a pitch from a first-time author, it's a little concerning because you're not quite sure if it's going to be a good book or not. And luckily it was. I read it and it's really good. So I did write my story and record a podcast with Mary, but it's about the author's experience researching and writing her first novel about this most unorthodox love affair that lasted 28 years until Chase Osborne's death in 1949. Mary had always been interested in the life of Chase Osborne, a character she discovered by way of a sculpted bust in the library at the Michigan Biological Station up north. Her father was a longtime biologist and botany professor at U of M named Howard Crum, and he took his family to live at the bio station each summer while he worked there. So when she was a kid, Mary was kind of drawn to this bust in the library at the bio station and never quite knew who it was. But as she got older and came to U of M, she did some research and discovered that it was this man, Chase Osborne, who'd been a one-term governor at Michigan and also a regent at the university. And so as she did her research about him, she started to discover that he had a very interesting life. He was kind of a Horatio Alger type who had made multiple fortunes, given them away, made more fortunes. He was an iron prospector, a newsman, a politician, a writer, basically a celebrity of the early 1900s, real mover and shaker. So Mary was intrigued. She had seen this statue when she was a little kid, did some research about him as an adult, wanted to write a novel, and thought, this character sounds pretty interesting. So thinking she'd write her first book about this man, she read news accounts, biographies, interviews with descendants, and one of his descendants, provided her with a private separation agreement signed between Chase Osborne and his wife, Lillian, dated in 1923. Meanwhile, Mary uncovered a most bizarre news clip that took her book in a whole new direction. So I'm going to go forward.
Just tap it. If you're used to a Mac, you don't click it, you just tap it.
Oh.
Yeah, just do.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. I rearranged my presentation before I came here, and all I've got is the old Andrea as my original one. So while Mary's doing her research, she comes across this clip. And the text reads, because Chase S. Osborne, 72, philanthropist, lecturer, writer, and former governor of Michigan, found his literary work too arduous for his advanced years, he adopted Miss Stella Lee Brunt, 37, his secretary at Sylvester, Georgia. Now she can give him constant attention. I think that's what he was looking for. But nowhere in her research could Mary find additional information about this unorthodox adoption. Like, there were no other mentions of Stella being 37 upon being adopted. There was no other mention of why this couple would have adopted her, and people were not aware of the signed private agreement between him and his wife. So Mary's, looking around trying to find some more information. Like, suddenly she's not so interested in Chase anymore. She wants to know what's up with this Stella person. And so she hit the big jackpot when she went to the Bentley Historical Library. So let me just give you a little feeling about, what she discovered while she was kind of doing her research about Mr. Osborne. So I decided to do a podcast with Mary because I thought this story was so interesting and I wanted her to tell it as opposed to me telling it.
He was responsible for the first workers' comp legislation in the state. So he really felt for the miners and for the people that work at the Sioux. He's the person who's responsible for the Mackinac Bridge. I mean, that's huge. And so he was very progressive. But where he wasn't progressive was that he did not want to damage his reputation by having a girlfriend. And so he came up with this ruse that they lived with for decades, that he and his wife Lillian, whom he was not divorced from at the time, he decides to adopt this graduate student in English at University of Michigan to be his paramour, and he could travel with her and say, this is my daughter, and he wasn't lying, he had adopted her. But all the documentation online and in books, biographies that have been written about Chase Osborne, all of them say Lillian and Chase Osborne adopted Stella Lee Brunt when she was 37. And I'm thinking, this does not make any sense. How do you convince a wife that you're going to do this? This doesn't make any sense. And I got in touch with one of the great-grandsons, and he was rattling this paper on the phone. I'm going to send you a PDF that you're going to find quite interesting. And it was the separation decree that Chase and Lillian signed in 1923. That this was not a platonic relationship. This was a way for them to live in that time period as husband and wife, but not legalize it.
So Mary, spent all her time reading all these news reports. She read biographies, and she wound up kind of figuring out there was something really unusual here. And for me, as she was pitching to me, I was interested in her story because there were a lot of different entry points to it. There were, we had the alumni connection. Mary was an alum. Her father was a longtime professor. She had other, I'm so technically inept. God, your computer is so sensitive, Andrew. I'm not sensitive. Okay. So one of the things I do love about these kind of stories is when it has a lot of entry points for alumni. So the story takes place in northern Michigan, where Chase Osborne lived, and he ultimately deeded a lot of his land to U of M, and it's kind of adjacent to the biological station. And Mary spent a lot of her time as a young girl at the biological station, and Kim, to my left, has written about the biological station, and in fact was going to write about kids who spent their lives at the biological station, one of whom was Mary. So it's really weird, how all this stuff kind of comes around. Also, one of the reasons that Chase and Stella even came to know each other was because Robert Frost came to the university in the early 20s on a residency that was funded by Chase Osborne. And Stella was a poetry student who experienced the Robert Frost residency. And in another story at Michigan Today about the Frost residency, Stella is quoted in the first paragraph because she was a very active member in the English department and the editor of a magazine called The Whimsies. So here's Stella already in my magazine. I didn't even know that. Meanwhile, at Lara's former job over at LSA, there was also a story about students and people, faculty probably in 2017, who went to revisit the Osborne property in northern Michigan. And Stella is referred to as his second wife in that story. And Mary had made it increasingly, extremely clear to me that Chase would not marry Stella ever. He would not marry her. So I'm like, what is this business about her being the second wife? Well, life goes on. What happened was that Stella, once she went through the Osborne residency, decided that she was so grateful to Mr. Osborne for funding it that she wanted to write him a letter. So she wrote him a thank you letter, and in the meantime picked up his biography called The Iron Hunter, which had this very handsome photo of him on the back of the book. So she kind of gets a little bit of a crush on him because she thought he was kind of handsome, and she learned about him through this book and found him to be very interesting. So thus she started with a thank you letter, and that began a decade-long epistolary relationship of letters, started with an innocent flirtation in 1921. Now, Mary just told us in that clip that he signed that separation agreement in 1923. So 2 years in, some stuff started happening in these letters. They met once in person in New York, and at that point the letters take a turn from friendly, let's talk about poetry, to other things that were quite interesting. So, but still, he absolutely refused to get a divorce because he had a reputation to protect. He did not want to be a divorced person, but sure, I'll live with you, and you can come secretly live with me and pretend you're my daughter. So how could this woman agree to live in secret with a man who refused to acknowledge her? So this is what Mary had to say about the beginning of their relationship.
She read his biography, which is fascinating, The Iron Hunter. And that takes his life up to 1919. So she's reading about him up until that point in his life. And, he's got a very attractive picture of himself, ruggedly handsome, and he had these arresting eyes. And so she falls in love with his biography. She falls in love with his image as a younger man. And he is very robust and everything. So, and then I took her from that girl, that young woman of the one who's corresponding for 10 years, I took her to a point of, okay, now this isn't so fun anymore, what we're doing. I'm pretty frustrated. Having a child now has passed me by. And I don't think she would continue to be that doting person. Yes, devoted, but not doting. And so that's where I meet her in 1937, 38, is she's no longer doting. She's a little irritated.
So they had been corresponding for 10 years and then decided they couldn't stand to not be together anymore, and he came up with this scheme to adopt her as his daughter and quote-unquote secretary. So, which she was. So with his wife off the island, Stella moves in with this much older Chase than she expected to meet. She had that image of him from the book, and he was like 72 years old at this point. She's 37. She's like, oh, hello, sir. So, but they loved each other. And Mary could tell that they really had a deep relationship because once she got to the Bentley, she really made this huge discovery. And for all of us who enjoy history, there's nothing more thrilling than a primary source, an original document, a piece of ephemera to bring history to life. And Mary hit the jackpot when she took her research journey to the Bentley.
You know, I'm a few years into the research about this and the creativity, and I go to the Bentley, and I think, what if there's a scrap? You know, I've got the PDF of the separation decree, so I'm on the right track here, okay? And I thought, I'm just gonna look for one letter. Maybe it just can even confirm beyond this separation. Well, like 600 pages of correspondence, and it was very candid, shall we say. I was shocked.
I can't even imagine the feeling of finding 600 pages of correspondence.
It was like Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, birthday, all rolled into one. I cannot believe this. And the language, so the correspondence started in 21 and ended in 31 when he adopted her. And then there was no need for this correspondence because they were then going to live together as family, however they defined it.
So as Mary's searching, you know, she's like, okay, this is an interesting story. Now I got to figure out if I want to write a novel and a novel of historical fiction, how am I going to frame this story? So what she learned was that in the summer of 1937, Carlton Angel, who is a sculptor, not related to President Angel, but he is the sculptor who made the pumas outside the Natural Science Museum that we all know. So yet another great connection to my alumni family. He was commissioned to go to the island, Duck Island in northern Michigan, to create a bust of the former governor. So Mary was thinking about that, and she thought, well, this is interesting because I can bet you any money Mrs. Angel was going to be a little suspicious about what was going on. Like, this father-daughter thing was a little unorthodox, and this is not right. And she had a feeling that her female intuition would lead her down that path, and that there would be some stress, so that was her drama for the book, some stress in Chase and Stella trying to keep their relationship secret and to keep people thinking that they were father-daughter. So that's where the fiction part of the historical fiction comes into play, because obviously Mary wasn't there and there's not very detailed documentation about that 3-month kind of stay on the island. But she has the 600 pages of correspondence, these letters. And she has this piece that Carlton Angel wrote when he returned from his job sculpting the bust. And he wrote pretty specifically about each of the days, you know, what the governor was wearing, how he was acting, what kind of mood he was in, and kind of described in pretty vivid detail the lifestyle that Chase Osborne and Stella were having on the island. So Mary had all that material to work with. So what she told me is that she took a lot of dialogue from the 600 pages of letters she read and kind of put those voices into her book and into the quotes between them, which made them very resonant of their actual way that they spoke. So it was historical fiction with a lot of fact factored in. This photo up here is a picture that Stella actually took when the bust was finished. And the thrill in her voice when she told me that the people at the Bentley found this photo and she could put it in her book, she was so delighted, because that's what her whole book was about, was this period of time that the sculpture was happening. So it was really cool for her to have the photo. So, you know, there's just this one, she just offers us this one brief snapshot to kind of encapsulate their whole bizarre relationship. But she, you know, after reading all those letters and whatnot, she really believed that they were in love, even though Stella utterly sublimated herself, totally, for the whole time they were together, never once told anyone that they were a couple. It was always that he adopted her and was her father. She even wrote a book after he died about him, in which she does not even mention herself. So Mary was so intrigued by, who would do this? Why would they do this? What is the story? Now he did, with all that said, she did get some things out of it, career-wise at least, where he was a prolific writer and historian, And so he gave her bylines. I mean, she worked on these books with him, and he gave her credit, so her name's right on the cover and everything. So on some level, she really wanted to be a poet, and she really enjoyed that Robert Frost experience. So she did write poetry, but not about her life. It was always about nature and very Frost-like writing. But she was able to accomplish some editorial goals by being his secretary and helper on these projects. But, so the thought is, well, was that enough? Like, she was very specific in their initial correspondence for the first 10 years, really, 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 really wanting to be married to him. He absolutely refused. And so she publishes about 100 pages of his letters at the back of the book, so you can read it for yourself. He typed his letters, and she wrote them in longhand. A lot of times he would return the letters to her with notations in the margins, answering questions or telling her to calm down, whatever. And there are a lot of all capital letters in his words, in his letters, a lot of all caps. Some very sassy language. As Mary says, her letters were ardent, his were graphic. So he wrote a lot of very sexy stuff to her that was pretty specific about their encounters that they had. So it's like she's trying to figure out, was this good enough for her? But clearly it wasn't. And it's strange because you do come upon you're seeing these things about her being adopted, and then here and there you're seeing her referenced as his second wife. So it's like, what is it? Well, it turns out, with further research that Mary did, she looked at the hospital logs and the nurses' entries at U of M Hospital in Chase's final days. So he's in the hospital, it's 1949, he's on his way out. And the logs read, it's like one day he's having seizures and they're giving him ice baths. And so in this beautiful longhand nursing writing, that she said it sort of looked like a guest book. It's like 9 a.m., morphine, 2 p.m., ice bath, 3 p.m., married, 4 p.m., seizure, 5 p.m. So somewhere in the midst, in the final days of his life, barely conscious, Stella got him to marry her, and he died 2 days later. 2 days later. So that was the end for him, and she finally got what she wanted. She got his last name as his wife. How she went around after that telling people, oh no, I wasn't his daughter, I don't know how she managed that, but somehow she did. In fact, at the end of his life, this picture appeared in the paper. Former governor and bride. Ex-Michigan Governor Chase Osborne, 89, is shown with his former adopted daughter, Stella Nova Osborne, to whom he was married at his home yesterday, shortly after adoption papers had been dissolved. All right, so Mary's whole point was, the story always stops right there. Like, did no one have any curiosity about what else was going on with these two? Like, and as my boss said, she goes, well, it's right there. AP told you. She used to be his daughter, now she's his wife. What more do you need to know? I'm like, I guess they did tell the story, but it wasn't enough. So, after he died, Stella did go on to a great career she wrote her own books, she wrote about him, and she also did a lot of peace work. She was involved with a couple of anti-communist organizations and did a lot of peace work and other community-oriented stuff. She was very involved with Lake Superior State College. Her whole life revolved around celebrating his legacy, celebrating Chase's legacy, while also finally finding her voice and making herself known. What I thought was funny is in this screenshot of the Bentley's resources, a finding aid, the first it says summary, correspondence, diaries, and other materials concerning her professional interests. So, it was Mary's real goal in doing this. This also happened during kind of the time that the Me Too movement it may have peaked and was sort of, getting quieter. But Mary really felt like Stella Nova, which is what Chase named her after he adopted her. Her name was Stella Lee Brunt, and suddenly she was Stella Nova. I don't know why, and she allowed him to do that. Mary really felt close to her in her heart, and she's like, who would do this? Why is this happening? And, what could she possibly have expected out of this relationship. And she said, I think she really, she was talking to me and she was mad. She said she was thinking about Chase rowing a boat on Douglas Lake up north by the biostation. And she was meditating on Chase, trying to get her vibes for her book. And she goes, but he wasn't talking, she was. And she was angry. So she said, I felt it was incumbent on me to give her a voice. And so that's what she did.
Younger women who read it, they're very angry with Chase. Older women are angry with her. I think she got almost all she wanted out of it. She signed on with her eyes wide open, given the times, and to never tell anybody. And I struggled with it. I really thought about it a long time, and I thought, wait a second, I really think Stella Nova wanted somebody to find this. How do you decide that you're going to dump this treasure trove of personal correspondence at the University of Michigan and not expect that somebody's going to come looking one day? I think she wanted to be validated for her actual position in his life. Nobody would leave this. She would burn this. And it wasn't that she just left one stray, incredibly ardent, graphic letter that Chase wrote to her about their physical relationship, but I found several. So it's not like, oh, that was stuck in between and, oh, I never meant to. I felt like she was speaking to me and that she wanted to be heard.
So that was what she decided to do, to give Stella her voice. And she did a really beautiful job. I highly recommend the book if anyone wants to read it. Very unusual love story, but also very intriguing and interesting and really well researched. She did, and thanks to the Bentleys, she got quite a gift in those letters. So that's her story. That's my story about her story. Thank you. I'm sorry about my technical malfunctions. I never knew a mouse that you just kind of stroked instead of clicked. I'm not familiar with their ways. And I don't know how to then
I do.
do your slides.
No worries, my friend. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you all tonight. And I'm really excited to tell you guys all about the story of Anna Fitch. And so for me, like Deborah's story, this begins with a discovery. And the discovery for me was an 1896 newspaper article from the Ann Arbor Argus. So I want you to imagine it's 1896. You've just gotten your newspaper. You're living in Ann Arbor. You shake it out and you read this headline, "The First One Hung." And you read a little bit further and you see that the first student from U of M has received the death penalty. And you read a little further and you see that this person's name was Herman Webster Mudgett. So who in the world was Herman Webster Mudgett who made headlines in 1896? Well, this is Herman. This is a photo of Herman Mudgett from his composite. It's a photo that was taken upon his graduation in 1884 from the U of M Medical School. Now, he doesn't look like much, but, and you might think, Herman Mudgett, like, what's up with this guy? But you might know him under a different name. You might know him as H.H. Holmes. And as H.H. Holmes, Herman Mudgett went off to Chicago, and during the 1893 World's Fair, he built what became called the Murder Castle, and he claimed that there he lured women in from the 1893 World's Fair. He lured them into his murder castle. He killed them, he dismembered them, and he claims that he did this to 227 women. Now, if you've heard of this story, it's likely through this book, Devil in the White City, which is a great book. It's my favorite. It's nonfiction that reads like fiction, and it was a best-selling book. You may also have heard of this story. There are multiple documentaries like this one, American Ripper, which questions whether or not H.H. Holmes could have been Jack the Ripper. Spoiler alert, the answer is no. And also Hollywood got involved in this story because here is Leonardo DiCaprio, who signed on to a Martin Scorsese film about H.H. Holmes, which was never actually made, but they got far enough in process that you can see that he dressed up as him, and here he is. So clearly much has been created about Herman Mudgett, aka H.H. Holmes. And to tell you the truth, this is what happens with serial killers. From the Night Stalker to the Golden State Killer to Ted Bundy, it really becomes about the murderers and about their crimes and about figuring out what's going on in their heads and what was their childhood like. And that becomes sort of a problem because it begins to overlook the victims, who in this case certainly are overwhelmingly women, and writ large in violent crime, most crime is committed against women overall. And that means that their stories and voices get lost in the cacophony of talking about the murderer. Which brings me back to where this story started, this article. And a portion of the article that caught my attention when I read it and wouldn't let go. So the article mentions that while he was at U of M, Mudgett courted a woman who's named only in the article as Mrs. Fitch, and she ran a hair salon on Huron Street. And it says that Mrs. Fitch discovered a letter from Mudgett's wife. And the letter was like, Herman, please send some money home to us on the East Coast because the baby needs new shoes. And Mrs. Fitch was like, are you kidding me? This guy was, the newspaper called it an affair, but he had asked Mrs. Fitch to marry him. And in this story, she's just appalled that she's actually already married. And in the 1800s, you have to think about this. Like asking a woman for her hand was a really big deal, and it wasn't done lightly. This was very serious business. So the story goes on. The same article goes on, and it's this one. Okay, the article goes on and says that Mrs. Fitch is so frustrated and angry that she gets a lawyer and she drags Herman Mudgett in front of the medical school faculty to be like, this is your guy and he's terrible and you need to do something about this. You need to punish him in some way. And she says, I have the letters from Mudgett professing his love and courting me, and this is not okay. And according to this article, Mudgett denies any of this. He denies even knowing Mrs. Fitch, and he claims that she was an opium addict and she made it all up because she's crazy. And guess what? The medical school faculty don't believe Mrs. Fitch. They believe Mudgett, and they dismiss her case. And that is the end of it, at least according to this article. But for me, that was the beginning of it, because I'm like, I have so many questions. And so for me, the first question was, okay, was any of this true? Because now remember, this article, this one, we're in 1896. This came out after Mudgett was caught. He ran from Chicago. He was caught by the Pinkertons. He was tried in Pennsylvania, and he was hung in 1896. So this article is after he's dead and gone. And there's so much what's called yellow journalism at the time, which is really sensational, exaggerated journalism. And we know, for example, that Mudgett did not kill 227 women. The number is a lot closer to nine people. And we also know that the murder castle, was probably not really like a torture chamber architecture phenomenon. It was probably just where he lived. And it's probably where most of his victims were known to him. So there's so many facts around this that have been exaggerated. It's like, is this even true? So that was the first thing I wanted to find out, like, what's up with Mrs. Fitch? Did this really happen? The second thing I thought is, well, if she was real, could he have killed her? Because there's a study out from UCLA that says that most serial killers begin killing people between the ages of 19 and 30. Mudgett was 22, so he's in the range. And Mrs. Fitch fits his profile. So again, most of his victims were known to him, and there was usually a financial motivation. So in this case, Mrs. Fitch, she's a widow, she has her own business, she might have resources that he was interested in taking for himself. And then the third question, which we can all relate to here on this panel, is there a story here? Is there some there? And could this go into Collections Magazine? Could this go online? What can we do with this? So we got to start with the first question. Was any of this true? And to answer that, we have to wonder who in the world was Mrs. Fitch? Because all I had was Mrs. Fitch and a hair salon. So I did what any smart person does. I asked an archivist at the Bentley Historical Library. And I asked my colleague, Brian Williams, and I said, help me figure out if Mrs. Fitch was real. And he said, go look in the Ann Arbor city directories. Now, these are a treasure trove of information. They often have people's names, their residence, their location of their residence, their gender, sometimes even their race. So I looked in the city directory, and lo and behold, I found her. She was in there. And it's hard to read, but the city directory says that her name was Anna. So her name was Anna Fitch. And it said that she was the widow of Lewis, and that, by golly, she ran a hair salon on Huron Street, and she was real. And so if she was real, to me, there was a good chance that this whole story about her and Mudgett was real. But I was then like, okay, I got to confirm this further. What do I do? And so the Reader's Digest condensed version of this whole thing is that I decided I would look at the Chronicle, which is a student newspaper that predates the Michigan Daily. It's the really early ones, and it's digitized, and it's online, and it is keyword searchable. So I just went to the Chronicle and I typed in Herman Mudgett. And I hit the jackpot, and Andrew was there when it happened, and Andrew was like, what happened? I'm like, I found him, he's in there. And so I found this little tiny blurb. You can't read it, don't even worry about reading it. It's this tiny, tiny blurb, and it says, this is what's in the Chronicle. It says, in the Ann Arbor Democrat of yesterday's issue, there appeared an article giving the reputed history of most unwarranted behavior on the part of W.H. Mudgett of the senior class. Severe charges are made against him, which have until now been floating in the air about the medical building. There are always two sides to the question, and Mr. Mudgett will have the opportunity of defending himself before the medical faculty, which meets this evening. We understand he makes a most emphatic denial. So this told me a lot. So this article came out on March 15th, 1884. So this told me that that night, on March 15th, 1884, the faculty were going to meet about Herman Mudgett and Anna Fitch, and it told me that the day before that the Ann Arbor Democrat had run a story about all this. So again, because I'm smart, I've got someone smarter than me, and I asked for help, and in this case it was Andrew, and Andrew helped me search a bunch of historic newspaper databases, because I was like, we got to find this article about that ran in the Ann Arbor Democrat. And we did. And check out this headline. The lead is wanted another wife. Herman Mudgett should join the Mormons because he has a wife and he wants another one. I mean, that's
my guy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a great headline. So this article backs up the whole story. This is that, Mudgett asked Anna Fitch to marry him. He said he had a wife and child, but they were dead, and that he wanted to, quote, take another partner to share his joys and sorrows. Listen, it backs up the whole story. And then I went to the medical school faculty minutes to see if there was any recording at all of this trial, this meeting. And unfortunately, there was not. So the medical school faculty minutes exist for this time period, but they did not apparently deem this important enough to record. But I had this article, and this was great. So it validates a lot about this news. This is the story that started it all, right? This 1896 story. It's telling me that this isn't yellow journalism. This is really like journalism. This is really good reporting, and there's a lot of there. And so if we go back to the questions that I asked at the beginning, the first one we've ticked off. Is any of this true? Yeah, we've got some newspaper receipts to show that this really happened. And then and that Anna Fitch was a real person. And then the question of, could Mudgett have killed Mrs. Fitch? Could Mudgett have killed Anna? Again, I was like, Brian, can you help me? And Brian, the Bentley Historical Library has an Ancestry.com account, and Brian was like, I'll look her up in Ancestry. And so he does his thing, and he comes back to me, and it turns out that Brian was able to discover that there was a Lewis Nelson who married Anna McNelly in Grand Rapids in May 1876. So this is Anna marrying her first husband, Lewis, in Grand Rapids in 1876. And then Ancestry tells us that Anna McNelly Fitch died in 1895 and was buried in the Fitch plot in Grand Rapids. And her gravestone says, wife of Louis. And she lived until 1895. And so I have to tell you, I was delighted. She was not a victim of Herman Mudgett. This is awesome. And also, she lived long enough, so 1895, she lived long enough to possibly hear that Herman Mudgett had been captured. Now, he was put on trial and died in 1896, but my hope is that in 1895, she was like, oh, I was right the whole time. And if, like me, you believe that Anna was telling the truth the whole time and the faculty got it wrong, you might also be interested in seeing and learning about another instance where they had to decide Herman Mudgett's fate and possibly got it wrong for a second time. So this is from the faculty minutes. It's very hard to read. All of this is so faint. But this is from the faculty minutes in June 1884. And the faculty are voting about whether or not to graduate, whom to graduate in the student class. And so there's Herman Mudgett. And the minimum score that you needed to graduate was 45. And gosh, Herman he got 45. He managed to sneak by just barely. And I thought, that is weird. That is so weird. How is that a thing? And if you turn the page in the faculty minutes, it tells you exactly why. Because they voted twice. And in the first vote, they were like, not this guy. He's a loser and we're not going to graduate him. And then they took a second vote. And they were like, let's reconsider this. And they thought, well, we're going to let him go. Well, he needs it. We're going to let him graduate. And so they took a second vote and they let him graduate. And it says the exact wording is H. Mudgett, failing to get the passing vote on the first ballot, was moved and supported that he be giving a passing vote, carried. So this tells us that twice, Herman Mudgett's fate was in their hands, and both times they sided with him. Once against Mrs. Fitch and once at graduation. And you have to wonder what might have happened if they were harder on him, if they kicked him out or held him accountable in any minor way. They might have altered his path in some way that possibly resulted in fewer victims. Now, of course, we'll never know that. That's just highly speculative. But now we can at least answer the third and final question. Is there a story here? And for me, the answer is a resounding yes. And for me, it's not a story about Herman Mudgett or the medical school faculty, but about a widow who stood up for herself at a time when women's reputations were incredibly fragile things. And instead of cowering in humiliation after she found out her fiancé was married, she got a lawyer and demanded Mudgett be accountable for deceiving her. So she may not have triumphed among the men in the medical school, but she certainly triumphed in the long run when the true character of Herman Mudgett was revealed. And I believe that she deserves to have her story told. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for being here. I'm the designated closer for the evening. Okay. So we're going to move from the late 1800s to World War II. Boom, just like that. This is a story I came upon. Total fluke. I was at the Bentley researching a different story. What I thought the story I was going to write about was about a Japanese-American alum who was killed in World War II. I think he has an interesting backstory. And as often happens when I'm at the Bentley, Brian Williams, who's the archivist, comes up and says, "What are you doing?" And I told him what I was doing. He said, "Oh, that's interesting. Did you know we hired a bunch of Japanese Americans who were held in internment camps during the war?" And I said, "No, I did not." And so that sent me down a very, very deep rabbit hole. Of course, the United States entered World War II in December of 41 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. We went to war against Japan, Germany, Italy. 2 months later, FDR issued what was known as Executive Order 9066. This required Japanese Americans and people of Japanese immigrants living on the West Coast to essentially turn themselves in to be incarcerated. And then they were put into camps around the country. So families had to give up their homes, give up their farms, give up their businesses. And there were 10 internment camps set up in the west side of the country. So if you imagine your whole life goes into a suitcase, essentially, and you're off to these camps. This image on the left is, there were a couple of horse racing tracks in California that were converted into quote-unquote relocation centers. So Japanese American families were forced to live in what had been horse stalls. So you can imagine what that was like in the hot summer sun of California. While all of this is happening on the West Coast in 1942, here in Ann Arbor, we are seeing this influx of soldiers, sailors, and Marines on our campus because the War Department has asked the university, excuse me, would you please provide some specialized training to our troops? So we are offering classes in engineering, cryptology. We had a Japanese language school here. The law school trained Army attorneys. And all of these young men and women, mostly young men, they're living in the dorms. The students got the boot. The military had first priority to live in the dorms. And they're using the cafeterias, they're using all the campus resources. We're talking several thousand military personnel on campus. At the same time they are coming onto campus, university employees are leaving campus. And they're leaving for two reasons. They want to go fight in the war, so they're enlisting, they're being drafted. And others are going to work in the defense plants that are popping up around Southeast Michigan, including the Willow Run bomber plant out on the east side of Ypsilanti, because they paid better than the university paid. And the labor shortage became so dire on campus that, for example, the hospital had to close its emergency room. We just didn't have the people we didn't have the doctors and the nurses and staff to treat people. And the university turned to students and said, could you help us out a bit? And so the students were raking leaves. They were doing some volunteer work, quote unquote, on campus. So this is where our two worlds collide in a way. We have captive Japanese Americans on the west side of the country, and we have a university in Michigan that is desperate for employees. Ding, ding, ding. If you lived in one of these camps, if you were held in one of the camps, you could request permission to leave if you could demonstrate that you had a job and if the camp leaders felt that you were loyal. And so they essentially had sort of like job fairs on campus. And so the university decided to head out west and begin recruiting employees. They first went to camps in Arkansas. Those were the most eastern of the internment camps, therefore they're the closest to Ann Arbor. And so we went to Arkansas to recruit employees. We started hiring in March of '43 is when folks began arriving. If you wanted to work here, if you wanted to work anywhere outside of the camps, you had to pass a security clearance with the Army. This is a typical form. This is many of these forms are in the Bentley records. All of these security clearance forms. This is where I learned about all the people who came to work here. And then once you were approved, you were on the payroll and you were good to go. By the fall of '43, we had more than 400 Japanese American men and women working here on campus. And they were working everywhere, doing all types of work, mostly in housing and at the hospital, but also at the union and the league. They were washing floors, they were cleaning the rooms, they were prepping food, serving the food, they were washing the laundry at the hospital, they were emptying bedpans, all manner of work that had to be done, again, because we had this labor shortage. At the same time that we were fine with employing hundreds of Japanese men and women, we were not fine with admitting Japanese American students who were applying to be students here. They were seen as a security threat. The employees weren't. And in 1942, there was a rumor going around because all the West Coast universities had to get rid of their Japanese American students that they were coming here to Ann Arbor. And Alexander Ruthven, who was the president at the time, said, oh no, they're not. It is our policy to discourage students from coming here. And these are copies of admission applications from Japanese American students. There's many of these at the Bentley, and they all have this type on them that says, refused admission. And the excuse was, it's just not a good time. This isn't desirable for the university. There's one letter from an admissions official to another admissions official saying, well, gosh, all we need is one Japanese American student coming in here and creating another, Pearl Harbor. How's that going to look for us? And so they were all rejected, and this is with the approval of the Board of Regents. We were not rejecting students who were of German heritage or of Italian heritage, but only of Japanese heritage. Interesting, isn't that? So this is fueled by fear, war hysteria, and good old-fashioned racism. So what was it like on campus at this time? There's a whole mix of attitudes that you can find in the records. You have somebody like Shirley Smith. Shirley Smith was the secretary of the university, which meant he worked with the Board of Regents and with the president, sort of the liaison between those two. He was a longtime administrator. He was a confidant of Alexander Ruthven, and he was very against the university hiring Japanese American people. He said, and I'm going to quote him, "The Japanese, even though born in this country, are of a different race." He said they are not Americans. And he was one of the people who kept track of Japanese Americans who were working on campus. There were other people who were more supportive and more encouraging and more welcoming, and they were often faith-based organizations on campus and in Ann Arbor. So you have to think about most of the Japanese American people who came here to work were young men. There were young women also, but it was mostly young men, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. They've never been away from their families. They were with their families in the camps. They've never been away from their families. So they're a lot like college students when they come here. They're experiencing this new freedom. They're homesick. They're drinking. They're dating. All of this is going on, this whole whirl of emotions and trying to settle in. And so some of the religious groups came forward and said, we got to help these people get settled here and feel like this is where they should be. One of the individuals leading this was this gentleman, Edward Blakeman. He was the university's religious education coordinator. And he was warning the higher-ups at the university, you are hiring too many people too quickly, and it's creating a problem on campus. It's creating a problem for them. And so that's, he and others helped create a club called Nisei Plus. Nisei is a person born in the United States or Canada to Japanese immigrant parents. So sort of a second generation immigrant. So Nisei Plus, the young people who are working here were all Nisei. The Nisei Plus Club, it was a social club. It met at Lane Hall. They'd bring in speakers, they'd show films, they'd play games and cards and whatnot. This other gentleman was also key to helping with the adjustment. His name was Shigeo Tanabe. This picture is him leaving camp. He was detained, and he's a Methodist minister. And he came to work for the Detroit Council of Churches. And he was very active in helping young people acclimate and settle here. So I thought I'd tell you just a few stories about some of the folks who came to live here. This is a photo that ran in the Ann Arbor News in 1943 when the young people first began arriving here. And they're very happy. They're singing songs. They're playing the piano. They like it here. But they really didn't like it here. The War Relocation Authority, which was the federal agency that ran the camps and monitored the Japanese Americans, they surveyed them while they were in their job locations to find out how was it going. And a lot of these records, the War Relocation Authority records, have been digitized and are held by the University of California system, and it is an absolute treasure trove. So they were reporting, this isn't really a real location for us, a real relocation for us. We know these are temporary jobs. There's no future for us here. We're not going to get promotions. We're not going to get raises. As soon as the war's over, we're going to get the boot because you're going to hire back, your other employees or your white employees. There's no future really here. They were paid the prevailing wages, which at that time they were getting between $100 and $125 a month. They were provided their meals, and for a small amount they could pay for housing. There was some designated segregated housing on campus for Japanese workers and also on off campus. And like all U of M service employees at that time, they put in a 48-hour week. But they were not like university employees because their names were turned over to the Ann Arbor police when they came to town. They always had to report their whereabouts. They wore credentials issued by the War Relocation Authority mainly to prove that they were allowed to be here and that they weren't escapees from the internment camps. And they could be ordered back to a camp for basically no reason at all. Talk back to a supervisor, don't show up late for work, boom, you're sent back to the camp. So, it was a mixed bag. It was a good experience, a bad experience. This young lady came to the university in 1943, December of 43. Her name is Amy Okabe. She was from Seattle. Her family was sent to a camp in Idaho. She came here and began to work as a typist for a professor of English. This was a little unusual for the employees who came here. She had a college degree. She was a graduate of the University of Washington. Most of the young people who came here had high school diplomas. So she got a pretty good job working in Angel Hall for this English professor. A couple of months before she got here, this guy arrived. His name was Earl Namba. He was from California, and he was held in a camp in Utah. And he came here, and he worked in East Quad. We don't know how they met, but we know that they began dating, and they dated up until around Christmas time, 1944, when Earl went off to serve in the Army. They continued to correspond even after the war was over, and Amy had moved back to the West Coast, and they got married in 1948. And they were married for 55 years until Earl passed away. It's kind of a happy story. This photo was provided to me by their daughter-in-law, who I was able to track down and ask some questions. Jiro Kakahashi was a young man who was sent from California to a camp in Arkansas. Rower was the name of the camp. This is the first camp that we went to recruit employees. He went by Jerry. He was a senior at the University of Southern California when FDR issued the executive order. He came here. He was in the very first wave of employees hired. There's some reports he may have been the first employee, and he worked at West Quad. And then the university approached him about a second job, and that was, would you go with us back out west and help recruit more people to come work here? Convince them this is a good place to be. And so he did that. And there's some correspondence where he reports telling his peers at the camps out west, that it's a good place. Ann Arbor's a good place. The public sentiment is okay. So come and work here. And so he was welcomed on these recruiting trips. He was a good representative of the university, it was reported. The only people who didn't like him were these guys. These are the MPs at the camps. They didn't like seeing him come and go because you're just not supposed to do that. He ended up going into the Army in 1944. If you talk about World War II and Japanese Americans, you have to talk about the 442nd Combat Regiment Team. When FDR issued that order in February 42, requiring everybody to go into the camps, it also banned Japanese Americans from serving in the American military. That lasted for about a year, and in February 43, that ban was lifted. And an segregated all-Japanese unit was created by the Army. By the end of the war, this was the most decorated unit in the history of the American military. One of the young men who joined this, I'm going to make sure I pronounce his name right, Takao Ninomiya, and I hope that's okay. He came here from California via camp in Arkansas, worked for a year at West Quad washing dishes, was drafted. The university sought deferments for the employees who were here, tried to keep them out of the war because they needed them as workers. But eventually those deferments ran out, and so Ted, as this young man went by, he was drafted in the spring of 44. In the spring of 45, he was with the 442nd Combat Regiment Team in Italy, and he was killed in action. He was killed on his 25th birthday. And about 6 weeks later, by now the war has ended in Europe, and there was a memorial service here in Ann Arbor at the First United Methodist Church for Nisei, who had been killed, who had lived here and been killed, and so he was one of those individuals who was honored. So the last person I want to tell you about is Donna Nagata. Dr. Donna Nagata is a professor of psychology here at U of M. Her area of expertise is the generational impact of wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans. And among her findings is that the men and women, the children who were held in the camps, don't talk about it, didn't talk about it. No looking back, we're only looking forward. And I found a little of this when I was tracking down some people or trying to find letters and whatnot. So the Amy and Earl, the couple who met and married, when I found their daughter-in-law, she said, well, we know some things about their time in Ann Arbor, but not a lot. And I was telling her stuff about, well, you know, your dad did this and your father-in-law did this and your mother-in-law did that. And it's like, we never heard this. They never talked about it. So Dr. Nagata started here at U of M in the early 1990s. And her father came to visit from California because he wanted to see where she lived and worked. And he got into town and he asked her, where do you work on campus? And she said, well, I work in a place called West Quad. And at the time, psychology had faculty offices in West Quad. And he started to laugh. And she said, what is so funny about working at a place called West Quad? And he said, well, I used to work there. He had never told her. She didn't know this. This was news to her about her father. She knew that he had been held in a camp in Utah, but she didn't know that he had taken a job here. He graduated from high school, a camp high school in 1944. He was 17. He had a one-way train ticket to Ann Arbor, and he came here and he started to wash dishes in the basement of West Quad. And 50 years later, his daughter is a faculty member with an office in the same building. And I found out about her because of Brian Williams. He said, you know, you need to talk to Donna Nagata in psychology. I said, okay, Brian. By the end of the war, the majority of Japanese American individuals who were living and working in Ann Arbor went back to the West Coast. They went back to try to rebuild their lives. Some moved to Chicago, which was a popular area to relocate. Some moved to Detroit, a handful, as best I can determine, stayed here in Ann Arbor. I am not aware, and I've done a lot of research on this, I'm not aware that the university has ever acknowledged the service of the Japanese American individuals who came to work here, who were recruited to work here. And we've never acknowledged, other than I think this story, that we were intentionally banning Japanese American students from admission because of their ethnicity. And that is my story. Thank you very much.
Well, those are three really fascinating stories, and there's a lot of connections between them, sort of thematically and the process of writing, and not just because of Brian Williams.
He's the biggest science connection.
But I wanted to start off by giving you all the opportunity. Do you have any questions or comments for each other about each other's stories?
Well, one thing I know about Kim's story, which I thought you were going to say, but at the end of the piece, or within the piece, she actually, the daughter asks her father, "Do you want to go into West Quad?" And he goes, "No."
Nope. No, thank you. He had no interest in going back in there. Yeah.
Kim, have you made the university leadership aware of your story?
So I've done dozens of stories for the Heritage Project website, and I have a lot of freedom with the stories I've done. This was one that I felt I needed to sort of run up the flagpole, in part because our president is Japanese American. He is a Nisei. And I thought, as a courtesy, he should be made aware of this story. And so people with bigger titles than me did that, and I'm told he read it and he was okay with it. That's as much as I know. But again, I just thought he should know about it. Our president, Santa Ono, actually, forgot to throw out his name.
Well, I have a question for Deborah about her story. Really, the story that you're talking about is two stories. The one story about Chase and Stella Lee Brunt's relationship, another about Mary Schulten's retelling of it. I'm just curious, when you were doing that podcast, when you were doing the write-up that was the basis for your talk tonight, how do you approach sort of balancing telling both those stories in a single piece?
It's hard, as you saw tonight. She, she pitched me on this story, and like I said, I thought, well, I could write about this author who has done her first book. But then, as we started talking about the story itself, that was so fascinating to me. And when she, just this weird relationship between these two people. And he was a very prominent person, a one-term governor and also a regent. And he seemed like he would be a pretty compelling character to talk about. But when she started telling me about her research and her process, and she had spoken to his descendants, and she had read these biographies, and she learned all these things about him, but there was no mention of Stella being his wife anywhere, and no mention or elaboration on this bizarre adoption. Once she hit me with the 600 pages of correspondence, I was like, I could do my whole story just about her at the library. And she even made a joke, like her nephew or somebody said, "I wish I could have had a camera on you in that room when you opened that box, because there's nothing like it." And so I was just really intrigued about her, mission and how she found out about this. And what was also really compelling to me was how much she used those letters to inform the conversations that Chase and Stella would have with each other in their own voices. She used words that they used. She emphasized things and he speaks the way he speaks in these letters. And she published 100 pages of this book are the actual letters, and she even joked they told their own story. It was pretty easy for me as a first-time novelist. But I was just intrigued by her, and then all the connections that the story had to the university in terms of, the bio station and Carlton Angel and him being a regent and her having experienced the Robert Frost era, and that being sort of the genesis of her relationship with Chase. So I let her tell her story of how she told that story. So, I just tried to stay out of her way. And I decided to do a podcast because she told it so eloquently, and I wanted to place the reader in the location and the time frame. So I found these songs through a public access website, public domain. One of the songs that played under the clip where she was talking was a Bing Crosby song, and I found songs from that era that would have been taking place, those songs would have been hits at the time that these incidents were happening. So, and then, use sound effects of birds chirping and fairies blowing. And my colleague made fun of me because when she was talking about she had to have wanted someone to find these letters. She said, most people would have burned them. They're pretty graphic and explicit, and there were love and hate in there where they were going back and forth. And she said, I just knew she would have wanted me to find them. And so as she was talking about that, I had one of those reverse, those beeps that trucks make when they go in reverse, like beep, 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 as they're unloading the trove of letters. And my friend Nicole at work was like, you kind of lost me there. But so yeah, I just kind of wanted to let her tell the story, and my text kind of just complements what the audio is. So she was just a very smart woman and really enthusiastic about the materials that she was able to discover. So I wanted to let her tell that, which I should have let her do tonight.
Speaking of materials, Laura, I'm kind of curious. So you've made a pretty strong case that Herbert Mudge's kind of a scumbag, even before he became a serial killer. Yep. But also one that was very clearly at least being sheltered to some extent by university faculty. Might be an interesting question. I don't know if you've looked into this at all, but did university faculty protect other students who were in similar situations? Have you seen anything like that?
Well, that's a great question. Where's Brian? That is a great question. I mean, I want to say yes, just because I think largely if you're white and male during that time and you're here, you're probably getting a pass for a lot of things. But I can't think of an example, so now I can't, I don't know. I can't think of an example, Andrew, off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's one in there somewhere.
I can't think of it. I was hoping you And similarly, Kim, I have a question for you. I mean, what was the relationship like between these Japanese Americans who were, many of them college age, with the student body at Michigan during that time?
There was really no interaction.
Really?
Yeah. They kept to themselves. And the gentleman I showed you a photo of, Shigeo Tanabe, he said, we are sort of self-isolating intentionally because of the way we've been treated since this war started. So there was sort of a suspicion. And I said earlier that the young men were like, they wanted to date. They were saying, where are the women? And they wanted to know, where are the Japanese American women who we could date? They said the white girls are stuck up, they won't talk to us. But they were also, there's some correspondence where they talk about the Japanese American, particularly the boys, they're reluctant to go out, walk on State Street because, okay, there's 5 or 6 Japanese American young men walking down the street. What are they doing here? They don't look like us. They were bored. They were bored and they were lonely.
Andrew, I thought of an example. I got one. And actually, it's a story that Andrew wrote. So this just came full circle.
He asked that question.
So during Prohibition, there was a raid on the fraternity houses by the police, and they just uncovered barrels of whiskey and beer, and all the fraternity members had stored it all for I think it was for the J-Hop or something. There was some big dance coming up, and they were like, we're going to have a party. And anyway, big raid. The police were not messing around. They took everybody to jail, right? Is that right? And then it turned out that the people who were swept up in the raid were like the editor of the Michigan Daily, the president of the student council, like all these, young men of establishment.
Big men on campus.
Oh, big men on campus.
Yes.
And so the alumni and parents were so incensed that they wrote to the president of the university, and they were like, you can't do that to them. And in fact, the university was like, you're right, we shouldn't do that to them. and they let him off. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I totally forgot to start writing that.
And I just thought of an example. You're talking about, did they interact with the Japanese Americans? Did they interact with U of M students? No. Because there were all these servicemen on campus, the Michigan League, which is a women's organization, established something they called the Acquaintance Bureau. So you, a young female U of M student, could basically put in an application, tell people about yourself, and the servicemen could look for a date.
Oh.
But they
like
didn't do anything
Tinder.
like that for the young Japanese American men who were here on campus and would have, I think, appreciated going on a date with somebody.
Wow.
The Acquaintance Bureau, I just love that.
I wonder if the Bentley has the records, because those would
Oh,
probably
that'd
be
be
fascinating.
pretty
snippet.
interesting, yes.
We'll have to look that up later.
Original Tinder.
Exactly. Swipe left, swipe right.
That's so wild.
Well, I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience, both here or online. Please raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone, so.
Kim, this one's for you. You mentioned that there was housing both on and off campus for the Japanese students. Do you know, I'm sorry, employees. Do you know where they were? Good question.
I do know, I don't have it with me. One of the fraternity houses was taken over, and it was called the Japanese House, and a number of employees lived there. Employees who worked at the hospital lived at the hospital. They were given lodging there at the hospital. They really didn't like it because they were often sort of a wing that they said that they were just down the hall from like the infectious disease unit. Like, what are we doing here? And a few folks rented housing, private apartments, private boarding rooms. There were some people came here by themselves. In other cases, entire families moved here. There are records at the Bentley of, a mother, her 6 children, all moving here. So they were looking for off-campus housing.
Well, I have another question.
Okay.
What advice would you all give to any aspiring writer who's interested in writing history, either university related or just in general?
I'll start. I think you have to be curious. You have to ask, why? How did this happen? We all have had the pleasure of working with Jim Tobin, who writes a lot about U of M history, and he says, pull the thread. So that thread on your sweater, and you start pulling it and unraveling, and Lord knows what's going to happen and where you're going to go with it. And I think that's the case when you're going through archival materials. You just have to sort of say, what does that mean? And always talk to the librarian or the archivist, because they know what they have there. I couldn't believe when Brian said, we have all these employment records. It's like, really? I mean, folders and folders and folders of the employment records of the Japanese Americans who worked here, and their security clearance paperwork.
And I would say too, to really follow your gut and your heart. Brian told me about those records. I was like, okay. It wasn't my story. He told me when I first started at the Bentley, and that's not to say that wasn't a valuable story, but it didn't call to me. I wasn't quite sure what that meant. but it was Kim's story. I heard about H.H. Holmes, and I was like, that's my story. So I think there's something to this. Like, you want to write the things that you're passionate about and that you're interested in. And I'll say, too, I joked at one point in my presentation that I had the Reader's Digest condensed version of how I found something. And it really is, like, there are so many dead ends where you look for something and you're like, that didn't work or whatever. I told you the brief version. And that's just part of it, but that's also part of the fun, because you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah.
And also, as pretty much you two both, you kind of start, you can't be married to your original idea, I guess. You might uncover something along the way that's more interesting than what you thought you were pursuing. You discover all these other things. And with our stories, you chose to focus on Mrs. Fitch and give her a voice. Mary chose to focus on Stella Nova and give her a voice. These other people are much more famous or have a lot more publicity around their lives, but there were other people that were part of that story that are equally fascinating. And you might as well put aside your original idea and go see what else is happening on the other side of your idea and take it from there. So.
Yeah, the story that I thought I was going to do at the Bentley about the one Japanese-American serviceman who was killed, I'm getting back around to doing that now, a year later. And God willing, it will be in the fall issue of Collections magazine.
That's right.
So you do have
you
to.
find a lot more stories within a story.
Yes.
And then you can set those aside. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Yeah, I'm kind of intrigued by Carlton Angel now. There you go. And his wife.
Do you know if he had a U of M connection? Or?
Carlton Angel?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he was an alum. I can't remember now.
You'll have to go to the Bentley and look.
Yeah,
wonder if we have his papers.
But we do have his artwork here on campus.
Well, thank you all so much for this really wonderful discussion and wonderful presentations. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. If you haven't yet, I really encourage you to check out any of these amazing publications these three wonderful writers work for. They're all wonderful resources, just full of all sorts of stories about the University of Michigan history. And I also want to just say thank you, panel, for sharing your stories tonight and also your thinking about the way you write and the way you approach your stories. I also want to thank Maggie as well for monitoring the online live stream, and also the Michigan Media team for making this possible for all of you who aren't here with us this evening. The Detroit Observatory is open Friday afternoons and Friday evenings for astronomy nights. Tonight's session will be available online in about a week for anybody who registered either in person or online. If you want to share it or watch it again. And it will be sent to all of you who registered via email, so you don't even have to look around for it. For those of you here at the here at the observatory this evening, the original observatory building upstairs will be open until 9 o'clock tonight. We have some really fantastic student docents who will show you the telescopes, tell you a little about its amazing history. If not, please come back again soon. I don't think we'll be doing the actual observing tonight, however, because, well, it's not raining yet. It's a little gray. But for those of you who don't stay or those who are attending virtually, I hope you can join us soon. Thank you, and have a wonderful